On the evening of March 17, 1983, inside a surveillance station buried 3 stories beneath the streets of West Berlin, a signals intelligence officer named David Brenner heard something that made his hands stop moving across the decoder panel. The transmission had come through on a frequency they'd been monitoring for 6 weeks. Standard procedure. Static, numbers, coded phrases in German. Nothing unusual. Except for one detail that turned his blood cold. Beneath the electronic distortion and the mechanical rhythm of the broadcast, he recognized a voice. Not the voice of an enemy operative or a Soviet handler, the voice of his wife. The room was silent except for the hum of equipment and the soft clicking of tape reels turning in the darkness. Brenner sat perfectly still, headphones pressed against his ears, as the message repeated. His supervisor was 3 desks away, filling out paperwork under a green lamp. 2 other analysts were smoking by the coffee machine, speaking in low voices about a football match. No one noticed that Brenner had stopped breathing. No one saw his face go white in the blue glow of the oscilloscope screen. He reached forward slowly and adjusted the volume, as if turning it up might change what he was hearing. It didn't. The voice became clearer. A woman speaking in German, reading coordinates and references to something called Operation Nightingale. The accent was perfect. Native, professional, but underneath the training and the controlled delivery. He heard the slight pause before certain consonants, the way she shaped the vowel sounds, the breathing pattern between phrases. He had listened to that voice every morning for 9 years. He had heard it whisper in the dark, laugh at bad jokes, read bedtime stories to their daughter. This was Emma. David Brenner had joined the National Security Agency in 1977, 2 years after finishing a linguistics degree at Georgetown. He spoke German, Russian, and Polish fluently, which made him valuable during a period when the Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had shattered détente. NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing II missiles across Western Europe. The KGB and CIA were locked in what intelligence officials called the most aggressive espionage environment since the Berlin airlift. Brenner's job was to monitor radio transmissions from East Berlin, intercept coded communications between Soviet handlers and their agents, and identify patterns that might indicate planned operations or security breaches. It was tedious work. Hours of listening to static and numbers, days of nothing. But it mattered. Every signal intercepted was a piece of a larger puzzle. Every voice identified was a potential link in a network. And now, sitting in that underground room with fluorescent lights humming overhead, he had identified a voice that destroyed everything he thought he knew about his life. Emma Brenner was a translator. That's what she told him when they met at a conference in Washington in 1974. She worked freelance, mostly technical manuals and academic papers, German to English. She was smart, composed, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed to see through pretense. They married in 1975. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in 1978. They lived in a small apartment in Charlottenburg, on the western side of the city, in a neighborhood where American families clustered together like survivors on a raft. Emma worked from home. She took Sarah to the park. She attended diplomatic functions when required. She smiled at other wives. She learned to make small talk about nothing. She was exactly what she appeared to be, until tonight. Brenner rewound the tape and played it again. The message was brief, 90 seconds. A series of coded instructions followed by a reference to an upcoming meeting. Standard dead-drop protocol. But the voice was unmistakable. He had spent 6 years training himself to recognize voices, to distinguish between accents and speech patterns, to identify individuals based on the smallest vocal signatures. This was not a mistake. This was not someone who sounded like Emma. This was Emma, speaking in a way she had never spoken at home, reading words she should never have known, transmitting information to someone on the other side of the wall. He removed the headphones and sat in the dim light, staring at the tape machine. His mind moved through possibilities like a man searching for an exit in a burning building. There had to be an explanation. A reasonable explanation. Maybe she had been coerced. Maybe the KGB had threatened Sarah. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate setup to test him, to see if he would report it. But even as he constructed these scenarios, he knew they were lies he was telling himself. The voice on the tape was calm, practiced, professional. This wasn't a woman reading under duress. This was someone who had done this many times before. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The Cold War did not exist in grand battles or cinematic confrontations. It existed in rooms like this, in the slow accumulation of information, in the patient work of listening and watching and waiting. It existed in the knowledge that your enemy was always present, always listening, always one step ahead or one step behind. The Berlin field station where Brenner worked was part of a vast surveillance network operated by the NSA and its partners in British and West German intelligence. The building above them was unmarked. The entrance was guarded but unremarkable. Beneath the surface, hundreds of analysts monitored communications across the Soviet bloc, intercepting military signals, tracking diplomatic cables, mapping the architecture of an invisible war. Everyone who worked here understood that the enemy was sophisticated, patient, and ruthless. Everyone knew that the KGB had embedded agents throughout Western institutions. Everyone accepted that paranoia was not a disorder, but a survival mechanism. But no one expected the enemy to be sleeping next to them at night. Brenner had been raised to believe in clarity, right and wrong, us and them. He had grown up in Pennsylvania, in a town where flags hung from porches and everyone knew their neighbors. His father had fought in Korea. His uncles had served in World War II. The concept of loyalty was not abstract. It was woven into the fabric of identity. When he joined the NSA, he signed an oath. He accepted that some truths would be classified, that some actions would be morally ambiguous, that the work required sacrifices. But he never imagined that the sacrifice would be this, that the clarity would shatter so completely, that he would have to choose between his duty to his country and his love for a woman who might never have loved him at all. He stood up slowly and walked to the bathroom at the end of the corridor. His legs felt unsteady. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows on the gray walls. He locked the door and leaned against the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. He looked the same, brown hair starting to thin, lines forming around his eyes. The face of a man approaching 40 who worked too many hours and slept too little. But everything behind that face had changed. The architecture of his reality had collapsed. He thought about Emma making breakfast that morning. Sarah sitting at the table, drawing pictures of horses. Emma smiling at him as he left for work, reminding him to pick up milk on the way home. Had she smiled because she loved him? Or because it was part of the performance? How long had she been playing this role? How many mornings had she kissed him goodbye and then transmitted secrets to Moscow? He returned to his desk and sat down. The tape was still there, waiting. He could destroy it, erase the recording, pretend he had never heard it. No one would know. The transmission had been logged, but the content would only be analyzed if he flagged it as significant. He could let it disappear into the archive, one more unintelligible message among thousands. But that would make him complicit. That would make him a traitor. And even if he could live with that, even if he could justify it to himself, there was still the problem of what happened next. Because if Emma was transmitting intelligence to the Soviets, she wasn't working alone. She was part of a network, and that network was still operational, still gathering information, still passing it along. And if he did nothing, more people would die. More operations would be compromised. More damage would be done. He thought about the previous 6 weeks. The pattern of transmissions they had been tracking. A series of messages originating from different locations in West Berlin, always on the same frequency, always brief, always coded. They had identified 3 potential transmission sites, but had not yet located the source. The operation was designated Nightingale, named after the call sign used in the messages. NSA analysts believed Nightingale was a high-level penetration of NATO or U.S. intelligence structures. Someone with access to classified information about troop movements, missile deployments, and strategic planning. The hunt for Nightingale had become a priority. Resources had been diverted. Surveillance teams had been deployed. And now Brenner knew the truth. Nightingale was not some faceless operative hiding in the shadows. Nightingale was his wife. The room felt smaller now. The walls seemed to press inward. He could hear his own heartbeat, loud and irregular, like a defective machine. He had spent years studying the psychology of espionage, reading case files on double agents and defectors, analyzing the motivations that drove people to betray their countries. Ideology, money, blackmail, revenge. He had always believed he understood it. But understanding it in the abstract was different from living it. Different from sitting in a dark room and realizing that the person you loved most in the world was a lie. He picked up the phone on his desk and stared at it. One call would set everything in motion. One word to his supervisor would trigger a full investigation. Emma would be arrested, interrogated, prosecuted. Sarah would be taken into protective custody. Their life would end. The apartment in Charlottenburg would be searched. Photographs would be seized. Letters would be read. Every moment of their marriage would be dissected by strangers looking for clues. And Brenner would be left with nothing but the knowledge that he had been useful. That his security clearance, his access, his position inside the surveillance network had made him a target. That Emma had been assigned to him. That their daughter might have been part of the cover. That every touch, every word, every shared silence had been calculated. But he didn't make the call. Not yet. Because part of him still needed to be certain. Part of him still hoped that there was another explanation, that he had made a mistake, that the voice on the tape belonged to someone else. So instead, he copied the recording onto a second tape and labeled it with a false designation. He filed the original in the archive with a note indicating that the transmission was garbled and contained no actionable intelligence. Then he put the copy in his briefcase and locked it. When his shift ended at midnight, he walked up the 3 flights of stairs to the street level and stepped out into the cold Berlin night. The wind cut through his jacket. The streets were empty except for a few late trams and the occasional patrol car. He walked slowly, thinking about what he was going to do, thinking about the woman waiting for him at home, thinking about the moment when he would have to look her in the eyes and ask her who she really was. The apartment was dark when he arrived. Emma had left a light on in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and listened to the silence. Sarah was asleep in her room. Emma was in bed, breathing softly, her back turned toward the empty space where he usually lay. He moved quietly through the apartment, checking drawers and closets, looking for anything that seemed out of place. He didn't know what he expected to find. A radio transmitter, coded documents, a passport with a different name. But there was nothing, just the ordinary debris of a family life. Children's books, bills, photographs on the wall. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his briefcase. The tape was there, small and innocuous, a spool of magnetic ribbon that contained the power to destroy everything. He held it in his hands and thought about all the ways this could end. None of them were good. David Brenner had believed in the system. He had believed that America was worth defending, that freedom was worth protecting, that the line between right and wrong was clear. But the Cold War had a way of eroding belief. It replaced certainty with doubt. It turned allies into suspects. It taught you that everyone was capable of betrayal, that loyalty was a liability, that trust was a weapon used against you. And now, sitting alone in his kitchen at 2 a.m, he understood what the men who ran this war had always known, that there were no clean choices, no moral victories. Only decisions that left you hollow and alone, wondering if you had done the right thing or simply the necessary thing. He put the tape back in the briefcase and locked it. Then he walked to the bedroom and stood in the doorway watching Emma sleep. She looked peaceful, innocent, the woman he had married. The mother of his child. And maybe that was true. Maybe the person sleeping in that bed was not the same person who had transmitted those coordinates to East Berlin. Maybe people were capable of containing multitudes, of living double lives so completely that even they forgot which version was real. Or maybe she had always known. Maybe she had looked at him across a table 9 years ago and seen exactly what he was. A lonely analyst with a security clearance and a need to believe in something. Maybe she had built a life around that need. Maybe every moment had been part of the operation. He didn't wake her. He didn't ask the questions that were burning through his mind. Instead, he lay down next to her and stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathe, and wondered how long he could pretend that everything was normal. Wondered how many more mornings they would have before the truth came for them both. The next morning arrived with the gray light that Berlin wore like a uniform. Emma was already awake when Brenner opened his eyes. He could hear her in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and dishes clinking. Sarah's voice drifted down the hallway, asking questions about breakfast in the way children do, turning every meal into a negotiation. For a moment, lying there in bed with the weight of last night pressing down on his chest, Brenner allowed himself to imagine that he had dreamed it all, that the tape didn't exist, that the voice he had heard belonged to someone else. But the briefcase was still on the floor beside the bed, locked and waiting. The truth hadn't disappeared with the darkness. He got up and dressed slowly, choosing his movements carefully, as if sudden gestures might shatter the fragile surface of normalcy. When he entered the kitchen, Emma turned and smiled at him. It was the same smile she always gave him, warm, genuine, the smile of a woman who loved her husband, or the smile of a woman who had perfected the performance over 9 years of practice. He couldn't tell anymore. Every gesture now carried double meaning. Every word could be code. "You came home late," she said, pouring him coffee. "Everything okay at work? Long shift. We're tracking something." "Anything you can talk about?" He looked at her. Really looked at her. Trying to see past the surface. Trying to find some crack in the façade. But there was nothing. Just Emma, his wife, making breakfast, asking normal questions. "You know I can't," he said. She nodded and turned back to the stove. Sarah ran into the room wearing pajamas with cartoon bears on them. She climbed into Brenner's lap and showed him a drawing she had made. A house with flowers and a sun. A family standing in front. Mother, father, daughter, all holding hands, all smiling. "That's us," Sarah said proudly. "It's beautiful," Brenner told her. And it was. A child's vision of safety, of permanence, of a world where parents didn't lie and homes didn't collapse. He held his daughter close and felt the weight of what he was about to destroy. After breakfast, he drove Sarah to school. Emma stayed home, as she always did. She had work to do, she said. Translations, deadlines. He watched her in the rearview mirror as he pulled away from the apartment building. She stood at the window, waving. Then she disappeared inside. And Brenner wondered what she did in those hours when he was gone. Whether she was really working on technical manuals. Whether the papers on her desk were what they appeared to be. Whether their entire life was constructed around the time she needed to do her real work. The drive to the NSA station took him through Checkpoint Charlie. The crossing between East and West, the most famous border in the most divided city in the world. American MPs checked his identification. German police watched from their posts. On the other side, barely 50 meters away, Soviet soldiers stood with rifles and blank expressions. This was the front line. Not a trench or a battlefield, but a street corner, where two ideologies faced each other across concrete and barbed wire. Where people risked their lives to cross from one side to the other. Where families were separated by walls and mines and guards with orders to shoot. Brenner had driven through this checkpoint hundreds of times, but today it felt different. Today he understood that the border wasn't just a physical line. It ran through homes and marriages and hearts. It divided people from themselves. At the station, he went directly to the archives. The room was temperature-controlled and windowless, filled with row after row of metal shelves containing tape reels, transcripts, and classified reports. Everything the NSA had intercepted over the past decade. Everything they knew about Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe. He found the file on Operation Nightingale and spread it across a table. 3 months of surveillance. Dozens of transmissions. Analysis reports from cryptographers, linguists, and field agents. They had built a profile of the operative, female, native German speaker with intelligence training, likely recruited in East Germany before being inserted into West Berlin. Probable handler operating from the Soviet embassy. Access to classified information about NATO command structure and missile deployment schedules. High-value target. But they had no name, no photograph, no confirmed identity. Just a voice on intercepted transmissions and a pattern of dead drops and coded messages. Until now. Brenner pulled out the copy he had made last night and played it through headphones. Emma's voice filled his ears. Calm, professional, reading coordinates for a meeting. He checked the date and timestamp. March 17th, 22:47 hours. Last night. While he was sitting 3 floors underground monitoring transmissions, his wife was somewhere in West Berlin with a radio transmitter, sending intelligence to the Soviet Union. He spent the morning cross-referencing transmission times with his own schedule, with Emma's calendar, with the nights he had worked late and the afternoons she had taken Sarah to the park. A pattern emerged. The transmissions always occurred when he was at work, when he wouldn't be home, when she would have privacy and time. She had been careful. She had planned around his life, used his absence as operational cover, and he realized that she must have known his schedule better than he did, must have tracked his shifts and his movements, must have built her espionage work into the gaps between their domestic routine. At noon, he received a call from his supervisor. There was a meeting in conference room 4. Priority level. He gathered his notes and went upstairs. 6 men were already seated around the table. Senior analysts, section chiefs, a liaison from CIA. The mood was tense. Someone closed the door. "We have a problem," the section chief said. His name was Morrison, 50s. Gray suit, the kind of man who had spent his entire career in windowless rooms, making decisions that never appeared in newspapers. "Last night we intercepted a transmission from Nightingale. Routine protocol. But the content suggests an imminent operation, something big. We need to identify and neutralize this asset before whatever they're planning goes active." Morrison spread photographs across the table. Surveillance images from various locations in West Berlin. Train stations, parks, cafes, grainy, black and white shots of people who might be guilty or might be innocent. The photographs meant nothing to Brenner, just faces in crowds. But one of the locations was familiar. A park 3 blocks from his apartment. The same park where Emma took Sarah every Tuesday afternoon. "We believe Nightingale operates within a 5-kilometer radius of the Charlottenburg district," Morrison continued. "Profile suggests someone with legitimate reasons to be in the area. Someone who blends in. Someone with cover that allows mobility without suspicion. We're looking at translators, journalists, teachers, administrative staff at NATO offices. Anyone with access to intelligence and freedom of movement." Brenner sat very still. His hands were flat on the table. His expression was neutral. Years of training in surveillance and counterintelligence had taught him how to control his face, how to hide reactions, how to lie without speaking. But inside, his mind was racing. They were close, too close. Within weeks, maybe days, they would narrow the search. They would start interviewing suspects, checking backgrounds, placing people under surveillance. And eventually, they would come to Emma. They would knock on his door and ask questions. They would search his apartment. They would find whatever she had hidden. And then they would know that he had waited. That he had known and said nothing. That he had protected her instead of reporting her. "Brenner," Morrison said, looking at him. "You've been monitoring the Nightingale frequency. Any patterns? Any identifying characteristics in the transmissions?" This was the moment. The decision point. He could tell them right now. He could hand over the tape. He could explain what he had discovered and let the machine take over. It would be the right thing to do. The legal thing. The loyal thing. But if he did that, Emma would be arrested within hours. Sarah would be traumatized. Their life would end in interrogation rooms and courtrooms. And part of him, the part that had loved Emma for 9 years, that had held her at night, that had watched her cradle their daughter, could not speak the words. Nothing definitive, Brenner heard himself say. The voice is female, native German, trained in radio protocol. But we haven't been able to isolate enough clean audio for voice print analysis. Morrison nodded. Keep working on it. This is our top priority. Nightingale has been operational for at least 3 years. The damage is already extensive. We need to shut this down before it gets worse, the meeting continued. Strategies were discussed. Resources were allocated. Brenner sat through it all, nodding at the right moments, taking notes he would never use, playing the role of a dedicated analyst while his entire world burned silently inside his chest. When the meeting ended, he returned to his desk and stared at the equipment, the tape machines, the frequency monitors, the tools of his profession, the weapons of an invisible war. And he understood now what it meant to be caught between two loyalties. To have your duty and your heart pulling in opposite directions with equal force. To realize that no matter what you chose, someone would be destroyed. That evening, he drove home through streets that seemed colder than before. The buildings looked hostile. The people on sidewalks looked suspicious. The city itself felt like enemy territory. When he reached the apartment, he sat in the car for 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do. He could go upstairs and confront Emma. He could demand the truth. He could give her a chance to explain, to defend herself, to tell him that this was all a misunderstanding. Or he could walk away, pack a bag, take Sarah, disappear before the entire structure collapsed. But both options felt impossible. Both required a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed. He finally went inside. Emma was cooking dinner. The apartment smelled like onions and garlic. Sarah was doing homework at the kitchen table. Everything looked normal. Unbearably normal. Brenner put down his briefcase and poured himself a drink. Scotch. 2 fingers. He stood at the window and looked out at the street below. Cars passing. Lights in other windows. Families living their lives. And he wondered how many other homes contained secrets like his. How many other marriages were built on lies. How many other people were standing at windows right now holding glasses of scotch, trying to decide whether to destroy everything or pretend nothing was wrong. Long day? Emma asked. Yeah, long day. She came up behind him and put her hand on his shoulder. The touch was gentle, familiar. The touch of someone who knew him, who cared, or who wanted him to believe she cared. You seem tense, she said. Just work. The usual. Anything you want to talk about? He turned to look at her. Her gray eyes met his, clear, honest, without guilt or fear. And in that moment he had a sudden, terrible thought. What if she didn't know? What if Emma believed she was exactly who she appeared to be? What if the KGB had recruited her years ago before they met, and she had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that she saw nothing wrong with what she was doing? That in her mind, she was serving a higher cause? That she loved him and betrayed him simultaneously, without any sense of contradiction? No, he said finally. Nothing to talk about. That night, after Sarah was asleep, Brenner lay in bed next to Emma and listened to her breathe. He thought about all the nights they had spent like this. Thousands of nights. A decade of shared darkness. And he wondered how many of those nights she had been thinking about dead drops in coded messages. How many times she had made love to him and then gotten up to transmit intelligence to Moscow. How many moments of apparent intimacy had been tools of espionage. The Cold War had taught him that the enemy could look like anyone, sound like anyone, be anyone. But it had never taught him what to do when the enemy was the person sleeping beside you. Over the next week, Brenner did something he had never imagined himself capable of. He began conducting surveillance on his own wife. Not officially. Not through NSA resources. Just quiet observation. He started paying attention to her schedule, her movements, the phone calls she received, the errands she ran. He came home early from work unannounced to see if he could catch her doing something suspicious. He searched her belongings when she was out with Sarah. He checked her desk for hidden compartments. He examined her papers for coded messages. But he found nothing. Emma was either completely innocent or impossibly careful. And the not knowing was worse than any truth could have been. At work, the hunt for Nightingale intensified. More surveillance teams were deployed. More phone lines were tapped. CIA officers arrived from Langley with enhanced interrogation protocols and polygraph equipment. The NSA began conducting random security interviews with all personnel who had access to classified information about NATO operations. Brenner was interviewed twice. He passed both times. He lied smoothly, professionally, with the calm demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide. And each time he lied, he felt a piece of himself disappear. On March 24th, 7 days after he first heard Emma's voice on that transmission, Brenner intercepted another message on the Nightingale frequency. This one was different, shorter, more urgent. It referenced immediate risk and route change and gave coordinates for an emergency meeting. He recognized Emma's voice immediately. But this time, there was something else in her tone. Not fear exactly, but tension, stress, the sound of someone under pressure. The message ended with a code phrase, "The Nightingale sings at dawn," and then silence. Brenner sat at his desk and played the message 3 times. Then he did what he knew he had to do. What he should have done a week ago. He picked up the phone and called Morrison. When his supervisor answered, Brenner said 5 words that would change everything. "I know who Nightingale is." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Morrison's voice, sharp and focused. "Where are you?" "At my desk. Stay there. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming down." Brenner hung up and sat in the silence. The room felt suddenly vast, empty, as if all the air had been sucked out through invisible vents. He looked at the tape machine, at the equipment that had brought him to this moment. And he thought about Emma at home, making dinner, helping Sarah with homework, living the last few hours of the life she had built. Living the last few hours before men with badges arrived and took her away. Before Sarah started crying and asking questions no one could answer. Before the truth became public and permanent and irreversible, Morrison arrived with 2 other men. They closed the door. Brenner told them everything. He gave them the tapes. He explained the timeline. He provided details about Emma's background, her daily routine, her access to information through his work. He spoke clearly and factually, as if he were describing a case file instead of his own family. The men listened without expression. They took notes. They asked questions. And when Brenner finished, Morrison looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you wait?" Morrison asked. It was the question Brenner had been asking himself for 7 days. The question that had kept him awake every night. The question that had no good answer. "I don't know," Brenner said. And it was the only honest thing he had said in a week. Morrison nodded slowly. "You understand what happens now?" "Yes. Your wife will be arrested. Tonight. There will be an investigation. You'll be placed on administrative leave pending a full security review. Your clearance will be suspended. Everything in your home will be seized as evidence. Your daughter will be placed in protective custody until the situation is resolved." Brenner nodded. He had known all of this. Had imagined it 100 times. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real, made it inevitable. "Can I be there?" Brenner asked. "When you arrest her?" Morrison considered this. "That's not protocol. I know. But she's my wife. I need to see her face. I need to know if she understands what she did." Morrison looked at the other men. Some silent communication passed between them. Then he turned back to Brenner. "You can ride with the arrest team, but you don't enter the apartment. You don't speak to her, you observe from the vehicle. That's all." "That's enough," Brenner said. If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile trust really was during those years, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories that should never be forgotten.